Everyone is waiting for the wrong ending. Ask most people how the world ends and you get one of two answers. Water, the way the old story says it ended once before in the days of Noah, or fire, falling from the sky, burning everything down to ash. But the oldest apocalyptic text we have does not describe either of those as the real ending. It describes something else, something slower, something that, if you read it the way it was written, has already started. The Book of Enoch is older than most of the scripture that survived around it. It was quoted directly by the men who wrote the New Testament, and then it was quietly left out of the book they were assembling. And buried inside it, past the fallen angels and the giants and the forbidden knowledge, there is a timeline, a step-by-step account of how the human story actually closes. Not with a wave, not with a meteor, with something the text says begins inside people, generations before the sky ever changes. And once you see the sequence laid out in order, it becomes very difficult to unsee where we might already be standing inside it. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what Enoch says the final generation of humanity looks like, the 10-week timeline written out in full, the J.S. passages that the popular English editions quietly shorten, and the actual canon list from the Council of Laodicea that shows exactly which books were kept and which one was left in the dark, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand the ending, you have to understand where this book came from, and why almost nobody read it for over 1,000 years. Enoch is named for a figure who appears for only a few strange verses in Genesis. He is listed in the line of descent before the flood, and then the text says something it says about no one else in that entire genealogy. It says he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Every other name in that list ends the same way. And he lived, and he died. Enoch does not die, he is taken. And an entire body of literature grew up around that single unexplained sentence, claiming to record what he saw when he was taken. What he was shown, what he was told to write down and preserve for a generation he would never meet. For centuries in the West, this book was a rumor. Church fathers referenced it. A few of them quoted it as though it carried weight. And then it disappeared from European view almost entirely, surviving in full only in one place on earth, inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had kept it in its canon the whole time, copied and recopied in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. When a Scottish traveler finally brought complete manuscripts back to Europe in the late 1700s, scholars who opened them found a text far larger and far stranger than the fragments they had been guessing about. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered at Qumran in the middle of the 20th century, Enoch was there too, in the original Aramaic, in multiple separate copies, older than the community that had hidden them. More copies of Enoch survived in those caves than of several books that made it into the Bible. Whatever this text was, the people who buried those scrolls did not treat it as a footnote. They treated it as scripture. And it is not one seamless book either, which is part of why it unsettles the people who study it. Enoch is really a small library bound under a single name, several distinct works stitched together across centuries. There is the Book of the Watchers, the oldest layer, which tells the story of the angels who fell. There is an astronomical book, obsessed with the exact motions of the sun and moon and the length of the year. There are dream visions that replay the whole of history as a parade of animals. There is a book of parables full of a coming judge. And running underneath all of it is the same insistent claim that a man was carried out of the ordinary world, shown the machinery behind it, and told to write down what he saw. The Aramaic fragments pulled from the Qumran caves are old enough that the Book of the Watchers was already ancient when the rest of the collection was still being written. This was not the product of one strange night. It was a tradition that a whole world took seriously enough to copy for hundreds of years. So this is not a modern forgery. This is an ancient book that was central to a world, and then removed from the center, and the question worth sitting with is not only what it says, but why the version of the end that it describes was the one that got left behind. Here is the first thing that breaks the usual picture. Most people carry a single idea of divine destruction. One catastrophe, one ending, one judgment. Enoch does not work that way. Enoch describes two destructions, and the flood is only the first one. In the story, as Enoch tells it, the flood was not the main event. It was a cleanup, a reset. Something had already gone wrong on the earth, badly wrong, and the water was the response to it, not the disaster itself. The real disaster came earlier, when a group of beings the text calls the Watchers came down and taught humanity things it was not meant to know yet, and took human wives and produced a generation of giants who consumed everything and turned the world violent. The flood washes that away. but washing it away is a mercy, because the point of a reset is that the story gets to continue. It is worth slowing down on how deliberate that first fall was, because it changes how you read the second one. The Watchers did not stumble. According to the text, 200 of them descended together onto the peak of Mount Hermon, and before they came down they swore a mutual oath, binding each other to the plan, so that no single one of them could be blamed alone. Their leader is named. The one who first taught the forbidden crafts is named. This was a conspiracy with organization and intent, and the knowledge they carried down was not scattered by accident. It was delivered, on purpose, to a species that had no framework to survive it. The giants that followed were only the symptom. The real damage was the transfer itself, the handing of world-altering power to hands that had not earned it and could not hold it. Keep that word in mind, transfer, because Enoch is going to describe the same transfer happening again at the end. And the second time there is no flood waiting behind it to undo the damage. The second destruction, the one Enoch spends the back half of the book circling, is different in kind. It is not a cleanup, it is a conclusion. There is no continuation written on the other side of it for the ones who fail it. And that is the ending most people have never actually heard, because the popular imagination stopped at the flood and simply assumed the sequel would rhyme. Water last time, so fire next time. Enoch says it is not that simple, and it is not that external. Because when Enoch describes how the second destruction arrives, he does not begin with the sky. He begins with people. He describes a slow corruption that moves through generations, and he lays it out as a measured sequence, almost like a countdown that a person living inside it would not feel as a countdown at all. It would just feel like history, like normal life getting a little worse in ways nobody can quite name. And the mechanism he chose to carry that countdown is one of the most quietly unsettling structures in all of ancient writing. He divided the whole of human history into 10 pieces and told you which piece you are living in. Think about how strange that is as a thing to do. Most ancient prophecy is vague on purpose. It speaks in symbols loose enough to fit any century, so it can always be said to have come true. Enoch does the opposite. It builds a numbered structure, a fixed spine of history with a known number of segments and a known destination, and it names the events that mark the boundary of each one. It is less like a prophecy and more like a map with the exit already drawn on it. And a map like that only has one real use. It is meant to let a reader locate themselves, to let someone, at some unknown future date, count the markers that have already passed and work out how much of the road is left. That is the function of the 10 weeks. Not to predict, but to position, to let you find the point on the line that says you are here. This is the section scholars call the Apocalypse of Weeks. In it, Enoch presents all of history from the beginning to the end as 10 weeks, not 7-day weeks. Each week is a great age, a span of many generations, and each one is marked by a defining event that anyone who knew the tradition would recognize. The first week is Enoch's own age, the beginning. The second week is the age of the flood, the great wickedness and the water that answered it. The third week is the calling of a chosen line, the beginning of a people. The fourth week is the age of the law, when a covenant is given. The fifth week is the age of the temple, the house built for God on the earth. Each week clicks forward, and each one is described in a single compressed line, the way you would summarize an era to someone who already lived through it and only needs the reminder. And then you reach the sixth week, and the tone changes. The sixth week is described as an age of blindness, a time when the hearts of people grow dark and wisdom begins to be forgotten. And at the end of it, the house, the temple, is burned, and the chosen line is scattered. It is a fall. But it is not the end, because after the sixth week comes the seventh, and the seventh week is where Enoch stops describing the distant past and starts describing something that reads, uncomfortably, like a mirror. The seventh week is called an apostate generation, a generation that turns away. Enoch says that in this week all its deeds will be deeds of apostasy, and that it is a perverse generation, and that wisdom itself departs from it. Not that wisdom is attacked, or argued against, or defeated. That wisdom leaves. It withdraws. Knowledge multiplies and understanding drains out at the same time, until people know how to do more and more, while understanding less and less about what any of it is for. And the detail that makes the hair on your arms stand up is that Enoch places the turning point of the entire human story right here, in this exact week, not in the future weeks of fire and judgment. Here, in the generation that stopped being able to tell the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the seventh week, the generation where wisdom leaves, is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original JE's account. the apostate generation, the departing of wisdom. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, hold that idea, the departure of wisdom, next to the very first thing that went wrong in the book, because they are the same wound opened twice. Remember what the Watchers actually did to trigger the first destruction. The text is specific, almost like a charge sheet. It names them, and it names what each one taught. One taught the making of weapons and the cutting of metal into blades. One taught the working of the earth and the mining of what is buried in it. One taught the mixing of cosmetics and the changing of the face. One taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, the manipulation of the body and the mind. Others taught the reading of the stars, the signs of the sun, the courses of the moon, the interpretation of the sky. And one, the text says almost as an aside, taught humanity to write with ink and paper, to record and to keep, so that knowledge would no longer die with the person who held it. Look at that list again, and notice what it actually is. It is not a list of sins in the way we usually think of sin. It is a list of civilization, metallurgy, mining, cosmetics, pharmacology, astronomy, writing. These are the pillars of the modern world. Enoch's original crime, the thing that broke the first world, was not violence by itself, and it was not lust by itself. It was knowledge arriving before the maturity to hold it. Power without the wisdom to govern the power. Capability that outran conscience. That is the wound. And in the 7th week, the apostate generation, Enoch describes that exact wound reopening on a civilizational scale. Wisdom departs, but the knowledge stays. The capability stays. The tools the Watchers handed over are all still here, refined 1,000 times over, and the thing that was supposed to keep them in check, the thing Enoch calls wisdom, quietly walks out of the room. That is why the honest answer to how Enoch says humanity ends is not water and it is not fire, at least not first. It is that humanity ends the same way it nearly ended the first time, from the inside, through what it knows and cannot control. The flood and the fire are just the closing of the account. The actual ending, the mechanism, is a species that inherited the full toolkit of the Watchers and lost the wisdom that was the only thing standing between the toolkit and the abyss. Enoch is not describing a disaster that happens to us. He is describing a disaster that is us, arriving on schedule. And you do not have to force the comparison to feel it. Enoch's charge sheet against the Watchers was, at its heart, a warning about tools that change the world faster than the people using them can change. Blades that made killing efficient, the pulling of metals and poisons out of the ground, the reshaping of the face and the body, systems for reading and predicting the heavens, ways to store knowledge so that it would outlive and outpace the wisdom of any single mind. Read that list slowly and it stops sounding like a myth about angels and starts sounding like a description of the last 200 years. That is not proof of anything, and honest reading has to say so plainly. It is a pattern, an old fear that rhymes very hard with a new one. But that rhyme is exactly what the 7th week is about. Enoch was not afraid that humanity would run out of power. He was afraid of the opposite, that power would keep arriving long after the wisdom to wield it had quietly walked out the door, and that a generation would mistake the growth of its capabilities for the growth of its understanding. That confusion, in Enoch, is not a mistake a civilization survives. It is where the ending starts. And Enoch is careful to say that this is not the finish line, only the last stretch before it. After the 7th week, the apostate generation, the timeline does not simply collapse, it resolves. In the 8th week, he says, the righteous are given a sword, and judgment begins to fall on the oppressors, and what was scattered is gathered. In the 9th week, a righteous judgment is revealed to the whole world, and the works of the wicked vanish from the earth as though they had never been written. And in the 10th week, the great and final judgment arrives, the one aimed not at people but at the powers behind them, at the Watchers themselves, the beings who started the whole chain of ruin back at the beginning. This is where the fire finally enters the story, and it is worth noticing where Enoch puts it. Not at the start of the end, at the very bottom of it. The fire is not the cause. The fire is the sentence handed down after the cause has already run its full course through human history. The judgment scene itself is one of the strangest things in the book, because of how procedural it is. This is not chaos. It is a courtroom. Enoch describes books being opened, records being read, deeds being weighed. He describes a deep place, prepared long in advance, a fiery abyss, and he describes the original offenders, the Watchers, being bound and cast down into it, not destroyed in an instant, but sealed away until the appointed day, and only then given over to the fire. Everything is scheduled, everything is documented. The text keeps insisting that none of this is arbitrary and none of it is sudden. It was all set in motion at the beginning, all of it foreknown, all of it written down before it happened, which is exactly why Enoch was told to preserve the account. Not to frighten his own generation, who could do nothing about a judgment thousands of years away, but to reach the generation that would be alive when the pattern completed. To reach, in other words, whoever would be sitting in the 7th week reading this and recognizing the shape of their own age in it. Enoch had already been shown where that final sentence would be carried out. Earlier in his journey, the text takes him to the ends of the earth and down into a place with no floor, a chasm of fire and pillars of falling flame, and he is told plainly that this is the prison prepared for the ones who crossed the line at the beginning. He is shown hollow places carved out to hold the dead until the judgment, sorted by what they did while they lived, the wronged kept apart from those who wronged them, all of them waiting. Nothing in these scenes is loose or dreamlike. It is architecture. Chambers, boundaries, a place for everything, and everything already in its assigned place. That is the tone of Enoch's ending. Not a world spinning out of control, but a world arriving, finally and exactly, at the destination that was drawn onto the map at the very start. The horror of it is not chaos. The horror of it is precision, the sense that none of it was ever improvised, that the accounting was always going to be settled, and that the only thing left undecided was which side of the ledger each person would be standing on when the books were finally opened. Now here is the part that should be impossible to wave away, and it is not speculation, it is a matter of record. The Book of Enoch is quoted directly inside the New Testament. In the short letter of Jude, near the very end of the Christian Bible, the author writes that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about these very people, saying that the Lord comes with countless thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. That is a near word-for-word quotation of a line from the Book of Enoch. A New Testament author reached for Enoch, by name, to describe the coming judgment, and treated it as authoritative. Which means that at the moment the earliest Christian writings were being composed, this book was not fringe. It was in the room. It was a source. And then, over the following centuries, as the canon was fixed, and the councils met, and the lists of accepted books were written and rewritten, Enoch fell off the edge of the West. It was preserved in Ethiopia and lost almost everywhere else, and the specific, procedural, uncomfortably detailed account of the end that it carried went into the dark along with it. And Jude is not the only fingerprint. The second letter of Peter, sitting a little earlier in the same collection, describes God casting the angels who sinned down into chains of deepest darkness, kept there until the judgment, which is the exact scenario the Book of the Watchers spends chapter after chapter describing and which appears nowhere in the Genesis account those writers otherwise leaned on. The story of the imprisoned Watchers had soaked so deeply into the world of the first century that its imagery surfaces inside the New Testament without needing to be introduced. Everyone in that room already knew this, which makes the later vanishing of the book itself all the stranger. The influence stayed. The source disappeared. The ideas kept circulating, quoted, and half-remembered for centuries, while the actual document that spelled them out in full went silent almost everywhere except one mountain church at the edge of the map that refused to let it go. You are welcome to decide for yourself why that happened. Maybe it was simply too strange, too full of angels with names and giants with appetites, too far from the cleaner theology the councils were trying to build. Maybe the version of the end it described, an end that begins in human hands and human choices rather than in a single act of God from above, was harder to preach and harder to control. What is not in dispute is that the account existed, that it was old, that it was quoted by the very tradition that later set it aside, and that it survived anyway in a Highland church at the edge of the map, waiting. So sit with what the oldest apocalypse actually says, stripped of the noise. It does not say the world ends because God grows angry and throws down fire out of nowhere. It says the world ends the way it began to end the first time, through knowledge without wisdom, through power without conscience, through a generation that can do almost anything and no longer remembers why it should not. The flood was the mercy, the reset, the chance to continue. The second ending is not a reset, and it does not come first from the sky. It comes first from us, from the slow apostasy of a generation, where understanding quietly leaves the building while the machines keep running. The fire, when Enoch finally lets it fall, is only the closing signature on a story humanity had already written itself. This is why the label people reach for, that Enoch is a book about the apocalypse, misses what it is actually doing. It is not really a book about the end of the world. It is a book about the end of a chance, The flood proved the chance could be given twice, that a species could break the world through borrowed power and still be handed a second beginning. Enoch's whole point is that the second beginning was the last one. There is no third flood written into the 10 weeks. The line runs from the apostate generation straight through judgment to a renewed world, and there is no reset button drawn anywhere along that final stretch. So the stakes the book is describing are not really the survival of the planet. Planets are patient. The stakes are whether one particular generation, the one holding the full inheritance of the Watchers with almost none of the wisdom that was supposed to come with it, can do the one thing the first world could not: recognize the wound before it finishes opening. Enoch clearly did not think that outcome was guaranteed. He seems to have thought it was merely possible, and that is the only reason he bothered to write any of it down. And the reason a man was supposedly taken up out of history and shown all of this, and then sent back to carve it into a book and hide it below the reach of the flood so it would outlast everything built above it, was not so that his own age would tremble. It was so that one specific later age would open it, read the 10 weeks, count forward, and understand which one it was standing in. He wrote it for the 7th week. He wrote it for the apostate generation. He wrote it, the text keeps quietly implying, for whoever came last. And the only real question the book leaves open is not whether the ending is coming, because Enoch treats that as already decided. The only question left open is whether the generation reading it would recognize itself in the mirror in time to become something other than the ending he described. Enoch does not answer that one. He leaves it, deliberately, unfinished. Because that part was never his to write, that part is ours.